I'm Ruby, and this is Celia and Clara.
And we're going to talk about the Bosnian Genocide!
The former Republic of Yugoslavia was made up of 6 different regions: Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina. The country was formed as a result of World War I, and this mandatory combining of so many different ethnic groups immediately caused tension between them, especially Serbia, Croatia, and Slovenia. In 1931, after Alexander I ended his dictatorship, there was a controversy between the ethnic groups over who had the most influence on the government. This resulted in an increase of the already present nationalism, which led to the first stage of genocide, classification. The nation was clearly divided, and like ancient Greece, Yugoslavians identified more with their ethnic group and religion than with Yugoslavia as a whole. However, during World War II, Josip Broz Tito of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia rose to power and became the president of Yugoslavia after World War II. The nation was first changed into a republic and then a dictator state under the rule of Tito, who managed to suppress the tension and create tolerance between the different regions. After his death, the region's disputes and desire to be the most influential power in the government were revived. Milosevic became the leader of the Serbs, and he began using propaganda and nationalism to negatively symbolize other religious and ethnic groups in Yugoslavia to get the Serbs to rally around him. In June 1991, Croatia and Slovenia were the first 2 regions to declare independence from Yugoslavia. The government of Yugoslavia was extremely opposed to the independence of other regions, so the Yugoslav army, which was predominantly Serbs, declared war and invaded Slovenia because it was the region furthest to the east, and Yugoslavia wanted to regain control of their borders. Luckily, this quickly subsided, and the small battle resulted in less than 100 casualties. The Yugoslav army was now after Croatia. They entered Croatia with the supposed intent to protect the Serb population there, but instead the invasion resulted in dehumanization. Aside from the current use of propaganda against inferior groups, the Yugoslav army executed hundreds of Croatians who they later buried in mass graves. It is debatable if this portion of the Yugoslav War was a part of the Bosnian Genocide or if it was just an act of genocide. Nevertheless, this crime was a clear act of ethnic cleansing, and it enabled the Yugoslav army to capture parts of Croatia. In the fall of 1991, Macedonia and Bosnia declared their independence from Yugoslavia, and because Slovenia and Croatia were furthest to the east and the remaining regions of Yugoslavia were further to the west, Bosnia was caught in the middle of all of them. Bosnia was also the most religiously and ethnically diverse. This made Bosnia the prime target of the Yugoslav War. Shortly after declaring independence, Serb militants invaded Bosnia's capital, Sarajevo, and shot at and shelled civilian areas from hilltops and the tops of buildings. No one was safe. Civilians were constantly being targeted, and the city was encompassed by Yugoslav forces, mainly Serbs. Bosnian forces, with the help of Croatian forces, attempted to repel the Serbs, but were unsuccessful. This eventually led to the organization stage of genocide. The Serbs began using detention camps and separated Bosniak children, women, and old men from the fit, younger Bosniak men, who were later executed. This was a tactic that was continuously used by the Yugoslav army when invading and capturing cities. More than 10,000 people were killed during the siege of Sarajevo. The massacre of Srebrenica is another prime example of the stages of organization and extermination. In 1933, under the command of General Ratko Mladic, Serb forces shelled the city of Srebrenica. They then advanced upon the city and transported the remaining women and children outside of the city. Many of the women were sexually assaulted, tortured, or raped in the process, and the remaining men were all murdered. The massacre at Srebrenica resulted in approximately 7,000 to 8,000 casualties, and mass graves were dug for the victims to conceal the genocide. All those who were not killed at the massacre were moved to detention camps throughout Bosnia. In these camps, the captives were victims to beatings, torture, mass execution, and if they were women, rape and sexual assault. These camps claimed approximately 10,000 lives, and it was estimated that in 1992 to 1995, there were 20,000 rapes in Bosnia.
The Bosnian Genocide was painfully effective. Many women were subject to torture, rape, and other forms of sexual violence. Thousands were buried in graves, and many were separated from family, friends, and loved ones. These vicious criminal offenses equally affected many populations. Women were being raped and killed systematically in Bosnia under orders. Drunk Serbian military men would rape women wanting to have Chetnik babies. They weren't interested in women who were already pregnant. Many women would get threatened if they didn't take their clothes off or follow orders from the men. Women who already had kids would get taken away from their kids, and most kids never saw their mothers again. Reports of mass killings and rape had slowly come out of Bosnia, and once photos and videos of concentration camps were released, the photos and videos captured the world's attention. Any war provides negative and often terrible living conditions for children. However, in Bosnia, children were targeted along with adults for destruction. Young boys, usually starting at the age of 13, were considered able to fight and were therefore seen as a threat to the Serbian population. They were often killed. They also became the favorite targets of snipers during the war by Serbian soldiers. These children were also forced to deal psychologically with the loss of their fathers and their families, as well as seeing their worlds crumble around them because of their identity. For the survivors in Bosnia, one of the most difficult aspects of the aftermath has been not knowing what happened to loved ones. This was made even more difficult in Srebrenica, where after the genocide ended, Bosnian Serb officials dug up the mass graves of their victims and reburied their bodies across a wide swath of territory in an effort to hide their crimes. More than 20,000 people were listed as missing throughout Bosnia, and more than half of the bodies have been identified. Two of the concentration camps, Omarska and Karaturm, were places where killings, torture, and brutal interrogations were carried out. The third, Trnopolje, had another purpose. It functioned as a staging area for massive deportations of mostly men, children, and women, and killings and rapes also occurred there. The fourth, Manjaka, was referred to by the Bosnian Serbs as a prisoner of war camp, although most, if not all, detainees were civilians. The Commission of Experts determined that the systematic destruction of the Bosniak community is the Prejudor area met of the definition of genocide. During the period when many prisoners were interned in the concentration camps, family members sometimes tried to obtain information from the police station in town. In some cases, instead of receiving information concerning the whereabouts of their family members, they were offered an alternative of paying for an exit visa for the family at large. In order to receive an exit visa, sums of money had to be paid to various municipal Red Cross run by the Bosnian Serb authorities, and real property had to be signed over to the municipality. Many survivors have had to live their lives not knowing what happened to their family members. Men were usually separated from women and their children. After that, many men and teens were forced to fight, while women and children were imprisoned or likely killed. After the war, the International Criminal Court was created, which allowed to create cases against people who had led or participated in the genocide. The International Criminal Court was formed to end the impunity of the perpetrators in mass atrocities, and was the first tribunal to prosecute genocide. It also has given survivors of rape, torture, and other terrible crimes the opportunity to tell their stories and what they experienced and what had happened to their loved ones and be heard.
In this segment, I will be talking about the overall course of the genocide through describing each stage. These atrocious crimes that represent the Bosnian genocide are the result of socially acceptable racial and religious discrimination that fueled misdirected hatred, causing everyday people like you and me to perpetrate barbaric crimes. Stage 1, classification, began with the previously instituted scramble for power in Yugoslavia. The Bosnian Muslims or Bosniaks and the Catholic Croats had experienced persecution in the past, and therefore it was no huge change when the struggle for power over Yugoslav territory drove the Serbs even further on their quest for ethnic domination, and thus led their dislike on the Bosniaks and Catholic Croats forward. In the eyes of the Christian Orthodox Serbs, these other two communities were seen as inferior, and they were determined to be the dominant society. The Serbian ruler Milosevic specifically targeted the other communities when he rose to power in 1987 by persisting that the other ethnic groups should be classified as subordinate because they pose a threat to their Serbian rights. Symbolization of the inferior communities by Serbs was intensified through the rule of Milosevic. Anyone who is not a member of the Christian Orthodox Church began to be labeled as a non-Serbian and therefore subhuman. The dehumanization of targets in the Bosnian genocide occurred with the use of propaganda techniques. Through access of social media and news networks portraying the Bosniaks and Croats as subhuman, the then leader Milosevic began to normalize discrimination in Yugoslavia. Brutal name-calling was apparently viewed as standard social communication in heated areas. Nationalism is still common among news networks to this day in Serbia and other areas of former Yugoslavia, and biased opinions are still being portrayed. This normalization of discrimination caused many other dehumanizing offenses to occur. The organization of this genocide was presumably pre-planned due to the fact that mass killings cannot be orchestrated on the go. Since the government has covered up evidence of the killings, it is difficult to determine the organization of it. The polarization of the targeted ethnicities occurred through the increase of propaganda. Milosevic used threats of dangerous extremist Muslims to persuade Serbs against them. He also brought up events of the past such as Serbs that were massacred during the chaos of World War I by the Croatians. These turned many average Serbian citizens into the perpetrators of an entire genocide. The preparation of this genocide is also not clear, since evidence for its preparation is not currently common. Military personnel most likely prepared by simply supplying itself with weapons, and also by arranging more than 600 concentration camps. Extermination occurred primarily in concentration camps and in some instances at certain locations that were adjacent to mass graves. The massacre at Srebrenica on July 13, 1995 is responsible for at least 7,000 people being shot close range, killing up to hundreds at a time. One of the worst concentration camps was Amarska, which was the location for thousands of deaths as well. The Bosnian genocide is known as the worst act of genocide to happen after the Holocaust in Europe. It held accountable for many acts of rape, family separations, deportations, and nearly 100,000 deaths, 80% of which consisted of the Bosniak population. Serbs denied access to all those who wanted to investigate their camps, including relief officials and journalists. As in the Holocaust, the Serbs wanted to hide what was happening. The Serbian government has refused to come out and issue its responsibility for the genocide publicly. Many Serbians claim that the events such as Srebrenica were purely war-related. So long as the truth is denied, there can be no meaningful reconciliation.